The sky over Martin Crawford's northeast Kansas farm turned the wrong color on the afternoon of November 14th, 1946. Not storm dark, not sunset orange, a pale, sickly yellow-green that made the bare tree branches look like they'd been dipped in sulfur. Martin stood in his barn doorway, pitchfork frozen mid-air, staring at that sky like it had just spoken his name. His father had taught him to read weather the way other men read newspapers. Clouds weren't just clouds. They were messages, warnings, promises, and that yellow-green sky, combined with the absolute dead stillness in the air, meant one thing. A killing freeze was coming, and it was coming fast. Martin had 60 acres of late cabbage still in the ground. The crop was 3 days from harvest, already sold to the Kansas City wholesaler who'd promised top dollar because the early frost had wiped out most of the Missouri cabbage fields. 3 more days and Martin could pay off the banknote that had been hanging over his head since the drought summer of '45. 3 more days and his wife Sarah could stop lying awake at night doing arithmetic in her head, figuring out which bills to pay first and which could wait another month. But that sky wasn't giving him 3 more days. That sky was giving him maybe 6 hours. Martin dropped the pitchfork and ran for the house. Sarah met him at the door, dish towel still in her hands, her face already tight with worry because she'd seen the sky too. She'd grown up on a farm 40 miles south of Emporia, and her people knew weather signs just like his did. Her grandmother used to say you could smell a hard freeze coming if you paid attention, something sharp in the air like metal. "How long?" she asked. "Nightfall. Maybe sooner if that wind shifts north." "The cabbage," Martin nodded. "All of it. We lose it. We lose everything." Sarah turned back into the kitchen without another word. Within 5 minutes, she was on the party line telephone, the kind where you had to pick up the receiver and listen first to make sure the Hendersons or the Wilmots weren't already talking. She cranked the emergency code that meant real trouble, not gossip or recipe swapping. 1 long ring, 2 short, 1 long. The signal that brought neighbors running even if you'd had a fence dispute or hadn't spoken to them since the 4th of July picnic. The old farmers knew things that never made it into the farmer's almanac or the bulletins from the county extension agent. They knew that when crows flew low and silent in the late afternoon, frost was 12 hours out. They knew that when chimney smoke fell straight down instead of rising, cold air was already settling in from above, like an invisible blanket. They knew that when the sun set behind a clear sky but the western horizon showed a thin, dark line like pencil lead, a cold front was racing in faster than any thermometer could measure. These weren't superstitions. These were survival skills passed down from fathers to sons, mothers to daughters, tested and proven over generations of Kansas winters. Martin's neighbor Tom Breslin arrived first, his '42 Ford pickup rattling up the drive just as the sun touched that dark horizon line. Tom was 63, old enough to remember the brutal freeze of 1912 that killed fruit trees all the way down to their taproots and put 3 orchards out of business permanently. He climbed out of his truck slow, the way men did after a full day's work, looked at the sky, looked at Martin's cabbage field and said just 2 words: smudge pots. Tom still had 8 smudge pots in his barn, leftovers from when his father grew apples commercially back in the '20s before the market collapsed. These simple metal containers with oil-soaked wicks burned kerosene or diesel fuel, producing heat and thick black smoke that could raise field temperatures by several critical degrees. The California citrus growers still used them. You'd see pictures in the farm magazines sometimes. Whole orange groves glowing with hundreds of little fires on freeze nights. "They're rusty as hell," Tom said, "but they'll burn." The second truck brought Henry and William Schneider, brothers who farmed adjoining properties 2 miles east toward Oskaloosa. They'd been listening on the party line when Sarah made the emergency call, and they came without waiting to be asked directly. Henry had his 2 oldest boys with him, and William brought a 5-gallon can of kerosene that sloshed in the truck bed. Behind them came Ed Morrison with his nephew Paul, then the Kowalski family from the farm that bordered Martin's north property line. The Kowalskis had only been in Kansas for 10 years, immigrants from Poland who still spoke broken English, but they understood freeze danger, and they understood neighbors helping neighbors. By the time full dark hit, there were 17 people in Martin's cabbage field. Nobody had discussed payment or compensation. Nobody had negotiated terms or talked about settling up later. The party line had rung with that emergency code, and they'd come because that's what you did in farm country. Next month or next year, when someone else's barn caught fire or their well pump failed or their wife went into labor early, Martin would be the one climbing into his truck at supper time without being asked. The temperature had already dropped 12 degrees since Martin first saw that yellow-green sky. He could feel it in his lungs when he breathed, that sharp edge that meant the moisture in the air was starting to freeze. The stars were coming out hard and bright, no clouds anywhere to hold the day's warmth against the earth. His father had taught him that freeze nights always came with clear skies. Clouds were blankets holding heat in. Clear skies were open windows letting everything escape up into the black nothing of space. Tom Breslin's smudge pots went out first, placed at strategic points around the field's perimeter, where the cold air would settle first. Ed Morrison contributed 4 more pots he'd found way back in his own barn, behind a pile of rotted harness leather and milk cans from the dairy operation his grandfather used to run. The pots were simple technology, just metal containers with adjustable wicks that you lit like oversized kerosene lamps. But 12 smudge pots weren't anywhere near enough for 60 acres. Not even close. Henry Schneider had an idea, something he'd seen his uncle do during the Depression years. "Old tires," he said. "We burn old tires, they'll smoke like hell and burn for hours." It wasn't a method anyone liked to talk about, because the smoke was toxic and the smell would stick in your clothes for days. But during the 30s, when farmers had no money for fuel oil or kerosene, they burned whatever would produce heat. Old tires, scrap lumber, corn cobs mixed with coal dust, anything that would keep a fire going through a freeze night. William Schneider and Ed Morrison drove back toward town, heading for the vacant lot behind Harris's feed store, where old tires got piled until someone hauled them to the county dump. They returned with 2 truckloads, 37 tires in various states of decay, some with the treads worn smooth, others with sidewalls split and steel belting showing through. The tires got placed in rows between the cabbage plants, 20 feet apart, creating a grid pattern across the field. Martin checked his father's old mercury thermometer, the one that hung on the inside of the barn door where wind and sun couldn't throw off the reading. 34 degrees and dropping fast. The cabbage could handle 32 for a few hours without serious damage. Below 28, the cell walls in the leaves would start to freeze and rupture, turning the heads to mush that would rot before it could be harvested or sold. The wind shifted at 8:30, coming straight down from the north like someone had opened a freezer door the size of Nebraska. Everyone in that field felt it at the same moment, that sudden temperature drop that meant the real cold front had arrived. Martin ran back to check his thermometer. It had dropped 4 degrees in less than 10 minutes. "Light them," Martin said. "Light everything now." The smudge pots went up easy, their wicks catching flame and settling into steady yellow burns that sent pillars of dark smoke rising into the night. The tires were trickier. You couldn't just drop a match on rubber and expect it to catch. They needed kindling underneath, something hot enough to get the rubber itself burning. Sarah showed up with her old wooden wheelbarrow, the one with the wobbly wheel that Martin kept meaning to fix, loaded with dried corn cobs and newspapers. The corn cobs burned hot and fast, perfect for starting stubborn fires. The newspapers were mostly last week's County Gazette, and some old Sears catalogues that had been piling up in the kitchen. Each tire got stuffed with wadded newspaper and a handful of corn cobs, then doused with kerosene from the cans the Schneider brothers had brought. When the matches hit those soaked papers, the fires roared up 6 feet high before settling down into the thick, rolling burns that would last for hours. The rubber caught slowly at first, then all at once, and soon the whole field was dotted with fires that glowed orange and red in the darkness. The smell was something nobody who was there that night would ever forget. Burning rubber mixed with kerosene smoke, and the sweet, slightly rotten smell of corn cobs smoldering. The smoke rolled across the cabbage field in thick black waves, lit from below by 3 dozen fires, drifting sideways when the north wind gusted, rising straight up when the air went calm. The whole scene looked like something from the war newsreels they showed at the Rialto Theater in town on Saturday nights, like those burning oil fields in the Pacific, or the factories burning in bombed-out German cities. But it was working. Martin walked the rows with his thermometer, checking temperatures at ground level where the cabbage heads sat. The smoke layer was trapping the heat from the fires, creating a pocket of warmer air that hovered over the field. The temperature at ground level read 32 degrees, right at the freezing point but not below it. As long as they could keep the fires burning, as long as they could maintain that smoke layer, the cabbage had a chance. Tom Breslin mentioned another trick then, something his father had learned from the fruit growers in Michigan. "You got water?" he asked Martin. "Running water from the well." Martin nodded. "Pump's working fine. Why?" "We spray the plants," Tom said. "I know it sounds backwards, but when water freezes, it gives off heat. Not much, but enough. You keep spraying. Keep a layer of ice building up on the leaves. It'll protect the tissue underneath." It was one of those things that seemed to contradict common sense, but worked because of basic physics. The process of water turning to ice released what scientists called latent heat, just a little burst of warmth at the moment of freezing. If you could keep water freezing on top of already frozen water, building up layers, you could protect plants even in temperatures well below the actual killing point. The big apple orchards out east used this method with irrigation systems. But Martin didn't have anything that sophisticated. What he had was a well pump, 4 garden hoses that could reach maybe 40 feet each, and neighbors willing to stand in a freezing field all night. Tom Breslin brought 2 more hoses from his truck, old rubber ones patched with friction tape that leaked at the connections, but would work well enough. Henry Schneider had a hand pump sprayer in his truck bed, the kind you used for applying pesticides, and Sarah contributed the hose she used for her vegetable garden in summer. They hooked everything up to the well pump, men working by firelight and starlight, their breath coming out in thick clouds. The group split up naturally without much discussion. Half would tend the fires, making sure the smudge pots stayed burning and the tire fires didn't go out. The other half would work the hoses, spraying sections of the field, coating the cabbage heads with water that froze almost as soon as it landed. Martin watched the ice forming on the outer leaves, building up in clear crystalline layers that caught the firelight and sparkled like broken glass. The work was brutal in a way that people who'd never done farm labor couldn't really understand. The temperature kept dropping despite everything they were doing. 29 degrees by 10 o'clock, 26 degrees by 11. Everyone's hands went numb inside their work gloves, that deep aching numbness that made it hard to grip the hoses or handle the fuel cans. The smoke from the burning tires stung their eyes and burned in their throats with every breath. The water from the hoses was so cold, it felt like it was burning where it splashed on exposed skin, and everyone's pants were soaked from the knees down, frozen stiff in the cold air. Sarah kept coffee coming from the house, pot after pot of it, the old percolator working overtime on the kitchen stove. She made it strong and black the way farm people drank it, hot enough to scald your tongue. But that was good because it meant you could feel your face again for a few minutes. Around midnight, she brought sandwiches, ham sliced thick off the bone from their own hog and cheese that she'd gotten at the store in town on Saturday. Nobody stopped working to eat. They just grabbed food with one hand, bit off chunks while they kept spraying water or adding fuel to the fires with the other hand. Young Paul Morrison, Ed's 17-year-old nephew, was working one of the hoses near the north edge of the field. He was a good kid, strong for his age, the kind of boy who could work all day and not complain about it. But around 1 in the morning, his hands started giving him trouble. They'd gone past numb into that dangerous territory where you couldn't feel them at all. Couldn't tell if you were gripping the hose or if it was slipping through your fingers. Tom Breslin noticed the boy fumbling, saw him trying to adjust the nozzle and not being able to work his fingers right. "Paul," Tom said, not loud, but with that tone of voice that made young men listen. "Barn. Now, get those hands warm." "I'm all right, Mr. Breslin, I can keep—" "Barn," Tom repeated. "You lose those fingers and you won't be any good to anybody. Move." Tom took Paul back to Martin's barn himself, made the boy sit down on a hay bale, and brought water from the house in a bucket. Not hot water, that was important. You couldn't take frozen hands and stick them straight into hot water, or you'd do permanent damage. Lukewarm water, just barely warm to the touch, and you warmed the hands gradually, slow and careful. Paul sat there in the barn with his hands in that bucket, close to crying but not quite, while Tom stood watch to make sure he didn't try to come back out too soon. Sarah took over Paul's position at the hose without being asked. She'd already been working for 9 straight hours by that point, cooking and hauling coffee and helping wherever hands were needed. Martin tried to argue with her about it, tried to say she should stay in the house where it was warm, but she shut him down with one look. This wasn't just Martin's farm or Martin's cabbage or Martin's banknote. This was their life, their future, their children's inheritance. She wasn't going to stand in a warm kitchen while everything they'd worked for got decided in that freezing field. The absolute coldest part of any night comes in that hour just before dawn, after the Earth has been radiating heat up into space for as long as it can, and the sun is still too far below the eastern horizon to start warming things back up. Farmers called it the killing hour, when temperatures dropped to their lowest point and stayed there, testing everything that was trying to survive until morning. Martin's thermometer hit 22 degrees at 4:30 in the morning. The fires were burning lower now, the tires reduced to smoldering metal frames with just a few flames licking around the edges. The smudge pots were running dry, needed constant refilling, but the kerosene cans were empty. 2 of the pots had already gone out completely, their wicks burned down to nothing. If they couldn't keep these fires going for another 2 hours, everything they'd done would be wasted. Henry Schneider looked at his brother William. Neither man said anything for a long moment. Then Henry walked to his truck, grabbed the toolbox from behind the seat, and came back with a length of rubber hose. "Help me siphon," he said to William. They drained the diesel fuel from Henry's truck tank, every gallon of it, into buckets and cans that got carried out to the dying fires. William did the same with his own truck, 16 gallons between them, diesel fuel that was supposed to get them home and back to their own farms and through the next week's work. Both trucks would be stranded now, sitting useless until someone could bring fuel out from town. The nearest filling station was 12 miles away, and old Carl Hoskins, who ran it, didn't open before 7 in the morning. But those 16 gallons of diesel bought another 3 hours of burning, 3 hours of heat and smoke, 3 hours closer to sunrise and safety. The fuel went into the smudge pots first, filling them back up so their wicks could burn steady. The rest got splashed over the dying tire fires, making them flare up hot and bright one more time. The smoke rolled across the field even thicker than before, so dense you could barely see 30 feet through it. Everyone's faces were black with soot. Their clothes stank of smoke and diesel and sweat despite the cold. But Martin's thermometer, when he checked it in the barn, had stopped dropping. 23 degrees, and it wasn't going lower. It wasn't coming back up yet either, but it had stabilized. The worst was over. The sky started changing around 5:45. You couldn't call it light yet, not real light, but there was a quality to the darkness that was different, a sense that dawn was coming even though the stars were still visible overhead. The smoke from the fires began to show gray instead of just black. The eastern horizon started to separate itself from the rest of the sky, showing as a slightly lighter band of darkness. William Schneider, who'd been tending fires for 9 straight hours, straightened up from adding fuel to a smudge pot and just stood there for a moment watching that horizon. "Sun's coming," he said to nobody in particular. His voice was hoarse from smoke and cold and not talking much. "We made it." The sun hit the top of the windbreak trees at 6:18 in the morning. Martin watched that first light spread across the cabbage field, like someone was pouring warm honey over everything, slow and golden and healing. The frost on every surface caught the light and threw it back, making the whole field sparkle like it was covered in diamonds. The ice coating on the cabbage heads glittered in shades of pink and gold as the sun climbed higher. The smoke from the dying fires turned from grey to white, to nothing, as the morning air warmed enough to disperse it. They let the fires burn themselves out. Everyone was too exhausted to do anything else anyway. They just stood scattered across that field, 17 people who'd fought winter for 10 straight hours, watching the sun come up on 60 acres of cabbage that had made it through the night. Nobody said much. There wasn't much that needed saying. Martin walked through the rows as the morning warmed, checking plants with the careful attention to detail that separated successful farmers from failed ones. The outer leaves on some heads showed damage, dark spots where the freeze had hit despite everything they'd done. Those leaves would have to be trimmed away before the crop could be sold. But when he peeled back those damaged outer leaves, the inner heads were solid and firm and perfect. The hearts were good. The crop was saved. Not a perfect save, not 100% like it would have been if the freeze had never come. More like 90% harvest rate, with 10% of each head going to waste. But when the alternative was total loss, when the alternative was the bank taking the farm and the family starting over somewhere else with nothing, 90% felt like winning the lottery. The neighbors started drifting away as the sun climbed higher and the temperature rose past freezing. They had their own farms to get back to, their own morning chores waiting, cows to milk and chickens to feed, and all the regular work that didn't stop just because you'd been up all night saving somebody else's cabbage. Henry and William Schneider would need someone to bring them diesel before they could leave, but that would get handled. Ed Morrison would drive into town when Carl's filling station opened, bring back enough fuel to get the Schneider trucks running again. That's just how it worked. Tom Breslin was the last to leave, loading his smudge pots back into his truck slow and careful, the way old men moved after working all night in the cold. He paused before climbing into his cab, looked at Martin standing there in the growing light with his face black with soot and his clothes stinking of smoke. "Your daddy would be proud," Tom said. "You read that sky right and you didn't quit. That's what counts." The Kansas City wholesaler showed up 3 days later, right on schedule. His truck painted with the company name and his scales certified by the state agriculture department. He walked through Martin's field with his clipboard, checking quality, pulling sample heads and examining them with the critical eye of a man who'd been buying produce for 20 years. He saw the slight freeze damage on the outer leaves. He saw where 10% of each head would have to be trimmed away. "I can give you 80% of what we agreed," he said. Not mean about it, just stating facts. Market rate for damaged goods. Martin had been expecting worse. Make it 85 and you got a deal. The wholesaler thought about it for maybe 10 seconds. 85. But I want first option on your crop next year if the quality's good. They shook hands there in the field. The deal sealed the way deals had been sealed for generations before lawyers and contracts made everything complicated. The money the wholesaler paid was enough to clear the banknote with a little left over. Not enough to get ahead, not enough to stop worrying about money entirely, but enough to make it through the winter and plant again in the spring. Sometimes that's all you could ask for. Sarah baked 17 pies over the next 3 days, one for every person who'd been in that field. Apple pies made with the last of the storage apples from their own trees, the crust made with lard and her own hands, the way her mother had taught her. She delivered them personally, driving their old 41 Chevrolet from farm to farm, never making a big production of it, just handing over a pie with a simple thank you and moving on to the next place. The Kowalskis got theirs, even though they barely spoke English, because help was help no matter where you came from or what language you spoke. The story of that freeze night made the rounds through the county over the following weeks, the way stories did in farm communities, where everyone knew everyone else, and news traveled along party lines and over coffee at the feed store. People talked about the Schneider brothers draining their diesel tanks. They talked about young Paul Morrison nearly losing his fingers. They talked about Sarah Crawford working a hose all night in temperatures cold enough to kill, but nobody made it into something bigger than it was. That was important. You didn't brag about doing what needed to be done. 2 years later, in November of 1948, a cold snap came through just as unexpected and just as vicious. This time it was Ed Morrison who had 60 acres of winter wheat at risk, the kind of wheat you plant in fall and harvest in early summer, and a surprise freeze could damage the young plants badly enough to cut the yield in half. The party line rang with that emergency code. 1 long, 2 short, 1 long. Martin Crawford was in his truck before Sarah even hung up the receiver, driving toward Ed's place with his thermometer and everything he'd learned that night 2 years ago. That's how it worked in farm country. You helped because someday you'd need help. You came when the party line rang because someday you'd be the one making that call. You taught your children to read the sky and know the signs because that knowledge might save their lives or their livelihoods someday. It was a system built on trust and reciprocity and the understanding that no family could make it completely alone. Martin Crawford taught those sky signs to his son Robert, who taught them to his daughter Jennifer. They probably don't need that knowledge anymore, not in the age of weather apps and freeze warnings sent to your phone with exact temperatures and precise timing. But the knowledge is still there, passed down through generations like a gift, like proof that their people knew things worth knowing, and survived things worth surviving. That yellow-green sky, that dead calm in the air, that thin, dark line on the western horizon like pencil lead. When you saw those signs together, you knew what was coming, and you knew you had maybe 6 hours to do something about it. The old farmers spoke that language of clouds and wind and sky the way other people spoke English or German or Polish. And they spoke it fluently because their survival depended on it. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this journey into the forgotten wisdom of America's farming past, please subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and share this story with others who appreciate our agricultural heritage. This video is inspired by real events and historical farming practices from the 1930s through the 1970s. It is not intended to represent or offend any specific individuals or groups. Martin Crawford is a representative character who reflects the experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar situations during this era, using the traditional knowledge and community cooperation that defined rural life in mid-20th century America.